other big game that I want to talk about here is Arkansas, Ole Miss. Arkansas gets to play a familiar role for them the rest of the way, which is spoiler. They're not going to make the SEC championship game, but they still could make a very good bowl game. We'll see what happens with the rest of the New Year's Six based on these college football playoff selection committee rankings, but they beat Ole Miss. They're going to be ranked. Ole Miss, however, is still playing for something. So, I thought it was interesting that ESPN's prediction metric gives Ole Miss a 74% chance of going into Fayetteville and beating Arkansas, which I thought was interesting, given that Arkansas has shown it could beat Tennessee and was in that ball game against LSU until it just broke wide open with, the fumble at the goal line that Cade Durham ran in, and then the game broke for LSU. But the Rebels haven't really played well at Fayetteville when the game has been there, right? I mean, the last time that they had a victory against Arkansas in Fayetteville was actually 2008 when Houston Nutt was head coach. And, that was after he returned to school, I think, for the first time in 10 years or whatever. What I also think is interesting about this is that we're talking about Arkansas being in a position to knock Ole Miss out of SEC championship contention for back-to-back years, right? Talking about, for the first time in back-to-back years. So it was 30-0 in 2014, and then there was the Henry Heave in 2015. But, Lane Kiffin's been building it back since then. And then you talk about since 2008, they don't play a lot, but they're still 8-8 the last, 16 times that they have played. So we're looking at basically the last time that Ole Miss went to Arkansas, Matt Corral threw 6 interceptions to Razorback players in 2020. I remember this game because I was like, ooh, Matt Corral. Turns out to be pretty damn good in the UFL, but still threw 6 interceptions to Arkansas in 2020. So we still think that Ole Miss is good, though, at least based on who they have played and how they have played. They're 6-2. They got a win against a Cheeks, Oklahoma. They could finish 9-3, but that 9-3 is also an interesting mark because they're actually still favored to beat Georgia, which I don't know about that. I don't know about that. But you know what? They look more as capable of beating Georgia, as Texas did, right? They're gonna have to have some things go their way. Their defense is much better than it was last year, but you need Trey Harris to be healthy. You need Jackson Dart to be able to find guys not named Trey Harris and Caden Prescorn. And you're probably gonna need Henry Parrish to have a damn good day running the football, which is more about your offensive line than it is him. But for Arkansas, this is much more about if you can beat Ole Miss and you can get a win late against Texas, you're going to feel good about this season. You really are. Because you've shown enough to have people feel decent enough to bring Sam Pittman back and to make a run at this thing in 2025. I would like to see them run the football well, right? I think that really hurt them against LSU. I think Jaquindon Jackson needs to get a whole bunch of touches if he's healthy enough to go. Taylor Green needs to have this playbook condensed for him passing-wise. As far as Bobby Petrino is concerned, make it simple, dog. Let the athlete be an athlete and give him a bunch of plays he feels comfortable with. Turn it into a Marcel Reed game like it was against LSU to finish, right, against A&M. I think they can win that sort of game against Ole Miss, and all you're doing is keeping the ball out of Lane Kiffin's hands. The more possessions you can limit, the better off you are as Arkansas, because we know Travis Williams is going to have something dialed up and ready to go. He demonstrated that against Tennessee. Also demonstrated that against LSU, right? Garrett Nussmeier didn't throw for 300 yards. I think that defensive unit has come on quite a ways, and they ought to be in a really good spot by the time it's all said and done this season, right? Last thing I wanted to talk about in as far as the SEC is parity is real. It's parity. It's not volatility. Volatility is up and down, how teams are winning or losing, like Vanderbilt beating Alabama. But 16 out of 37 SEC games have been decided by a score or fewer, right? 8 points or fewer, which is already a possession less than it was a year ago, right? So Georgia's margin of victory in 2023 was basically 21 points. In 2022, it was 28 points. And in 2021, it was 32 points. And that's as high as it got before 2017 when it was 17 points in SEC play. However, this year, we've seen that number come down quite a bit all across the board, right? So Texas A&M actually leads the SEC in margin of victory, which makes sense because they're the last undefeated team in SEC play this year, with 14.6, which sounds like a lot, but it's really not that many points. 16 games decided by one possession have involved teams that weren't in the same division as last year, which leads me to this other thing where we're seeing scheduling really factor into what teams are winning and how. So, for instance, Texas plays Oklahoma every year. Oklahoma plays Texas every year. Texas beat Oklahoma 34-3. That's a margin of victory by 31 points. But then Texas plays Mississippi State, closer game. Plays Georgia, closer game. Plays Vanderbilt, team they ain't played since 1928. They win by 3. It really does matter who has seen you and what you know about them this year more than any other. And as we see more of these matchups that we haven't seen in a very, very long time, like Texas, Vanderbilt, or that we haven't seen often enough, Texas, Mississippi State, we're going to see more volatility. And I think that's great. You're also got to take into account what I know a lot of people that comment on the show like to talk about, which is transfers. So the unintended consequence of having so many transfers that I think gets unsaid is that there's not very much depth on most people's teams anymore. Ohio State is a great example of this when we're talking about offensive line, but even Kirby Smart has said, look, we're not as deep as we have been in years past, but we also are seeing that our opponents aren't as deep as they were in years past, and you're really top heavy, right? You're really talented at across the board if you're in the top echelon of the SEC or Big Ten. It's your third string, your fourth string where you start to suffer because guys are getting paid and guys are transferring. So that happens. I am curious to find out in November how much the injuries to these teams factor into not just winning football games, but whether or not the select committee actually keys on this stuff like it did last year. Remember, Florida State loses Jordan Travis, and the select committee decides that's not a playoff team, no matter what you do against ACC opponents, right? I think that's going to get magnified. I think if you got enough significant injuries, we're going to take that into account. So, for instance, if Miami is undefeated at the end and Cam Ward goes down with an injury, knocking on wood, I don't think they're going to put Miami into the college football playoff as the highest ranked, as one of the 4 highest ranked Group of 5 champions. I do think they'll get in, though, right? It would be, okay, do we think that Boise State is better because Ashton Genty's healthy, right? It would be, do we think that Iowa State, BYU are better because they got healthy quarterbacks, you know? That stuff is really going to factor, and that stuff is really going to matter as we start talking about who the 12 best teams in the sport are.